Okay, we're back and we're looking at World War One from the U.S. perspective. We want to make sure we go back through and look at what caused World War One and the four main causes, if you remember: militarism, people growing militaries, showing off their might. If you're going to buy the firecracker. If you're going to build a great big ship, you're going to eventually end up wanting to use it, or you would use it. Alliances. They never thought that we would have the war because each side had alliances with other powers and said we'll never end up, nobody will ever challenge us. And then we had imperialism. And remember, imperialism is that I want to expand my market share of a product or growing, and our economies are growing. This is during the Industrial Revolution, and so we want to increase our market share somewhere outside of our borders, or we want to get more products to like rubber or sugar, tobacco. These are going to help our marketplace. Again, Hershey needs sugar to do the candy bar. And so and then the last one is nationalism, and nationalism is taking pride in one's country, and that our country has precedence over the entire world. So we're going to have the World War One start in 1914, as we explained, with the entire Archduke Ferdinand being shot by Mr. Princeps and the Austrian Empire going down to make things right with the Serbian people, and then Russia going to their defense, Germany declaring war, France and England declaring war on them. And now you've got World War One starting in 1914. Now the United States, we won't get involved until April 16th of 1917. And we're going to only be in it for 19 months. So let's take a look at it and see if we can make sense of what happens here. First of all, the United States is an isolationist country at the time. We had, after the Civil War in 1865, had experienced the worst war of our history. And there was a great many Americans that remembered that and wanted nothing to do with going back into the carnage of killing one another. A lot of the reasons were, and it was a legitimate one, remember, people are coming. We are taking a lot of immigrants, and a great many of them are coming from Germany, Central Europe, Austria, and again, down in the southern part where the Slavic countries are at, Serbia and those groups of bodies right there. So we have a lot of people that have been naturalized citizens. They weren't born here. They weren't native, but they were naturalized. They became citizens, and they have sympathies towards these native countries. So why would I want to go back and kill my uncle or my family who lives in one of these countries? So they say, why get involved? Stay out of it. It's a European conflict. Don't get involved. The next one was we had a number, and it was a small contingent, but a vocal one, I think somewhat like we are today, of socialists, primarily part of the unions, the one union that was called the Wobblies. And they believed that this conflict was simply an imperialistic struggle for control of natural resources, that they wanted to have it for nothing more than I want to have that rubber or I want to have that market share. And that had an appeal to certain people. Again, as I mentioned, there was a lot of Americans that simply said, we don't want to get involved with this because we've seen the carnage and the after effects of the Civil War. And in fact, a great many of them, Mr. Wilson, who will follow Mr. Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, said, we're too proud to get involved in a war. And I think we can make an argument to some extent. President Obama was asking the question of what are we gaining from these wars? And there was a lot of people that agreed with him. That's part of the reason why he won the election in 2008 and 2012. Was there was a great many people that were tired of war and saying what are we getting out of this? They don't want to see their sons go off and die in the horrors of warfare. And so they just said, let's stay out of it. Economy is booming, remember? Life was good, though by no means are we were the cities safe in some ways. Your building codes, your standard of living, or your safety in some of those cities was horrific, but it was still better than what they had been experiencing in Europe or any other time that they've been around. So your working conditions weren't great, but you were still making better money than what you had been. So a lot of people said, why in the world would we ever want to get involved in this? And we became an isolationist country. And this will be an argument that today you'll have a number of people say, look, when America puts its head in the sand and it doesn't pay attention to what's going on, bad things in the world happen. And we need to be actively involved and lead. Who's right? Well, it's kind of whoever is up at the podium last. Sometimes you can, both sides make strong arguments, but you have to be the one that makes a decision for yourself. America will eventually get involved in the war, and there's a number of reasons that kind of make us go. The first one was in May 7th of 1915. We had a boat, a huge ocean liner boat that was from England that had come to the United States and was returning back, and it had 1,100 civilians on board. And the Germany had actually taken newspaper ads out in U.S. newspapers and told people, hey, listen, don't get on these merchant ships, these passenger ships, because these passenger ships are being equipped with aid for England, and we're not going to let it go through, and we're going to sink the ship. We're not going to warn you. We're just going to sink the ship. And they actually took ads out in U.S. newspapers to say, if you get on board here, we're telling you this could happen. And on May 7th, Germany, with one of their U-boats, did in fact sink the Lusitania, killing 1,100 people. And it was found a number of years later that, yes, in fact, according to these papers, top secret papers of England, the Lusitania was carrying a great deal of ammunition and arms for England. So there's a certain point where you say you don't sink a ship with a bunch of innocent bystanders. At the same time, Germany says you don't put arms on a ship during war and expect us to not take action against it. But this will infuriate America. There will be the former president, Mr. Roosevelt, will call for the United States to immediately go to war. And President Wilson will say no, hold on to that. And we get to Germany and we have Germany agree that they will stop sinking their passenger ships with their U-boats. And the U-boat is the submarine. The next one that was really damaging was when the foreign minister, Germany's foreign minister to the United States, a guy by the name of Arthur Zimmerman, sent a note that was intercepted. And in the note, it was saying that Germany was going to go back to unrestricted submarine warfare and that they would soon be sinking any kind of ship because there was just too many supplies coming into England. And by 1917, we're in a war of attrition. Who can hang on the longest? Neither side's going to win it. It's just who can still be standing in the end. And Germany said, we just can't keep letting America supply England and France with supplies. The reason the United States was giving aid to the Britain and to France is because these guys were heavily indebted to the United States. We did a lot of business transactions with France and England, more so than Germany and Austria. And so we had more money to lose if, in fact, England was to lose or France was to lose. So the second part of it, though, of the Zimmerman note was really the damaging one, and that was where Germany was trying to make a pact with Mexico, saying, hey, Mexico, if America gets in the war and you were willing to attack America, Germany was promising to give back the lands that they had lost in the Mexican War, which was New Mexico and Texas and California. And when America hears that, it's completely everyone around the country sees this and says we can't allow this to happen. And then that's when you're going to see even the president Wilson become enraged by this and simply say we've got to go. The last one is because America, as I mentioned to you, has got such a strong economic commitment to Britain. If Britain was to lose the war and France would have lost the war, there was a significant chance that they would have never been able to pay back America, and that would have crushed the American economy. And so you can say, and with quite certainty, that sometimes the big guys, the big merchant or the big companies, excuse me, they kind of forced the hand for America to go to war because the economy would have been shut down. And so those three reasons, again, the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmerman note, and the fact that we were so committed to the Western allies of the alliance allies, excuse me, in World War I, those all accumulated to us going to finally war. We will go to war in May of 1917. And when we went to war, the United States was woefully underprepared. We had something like 240,000 active servicemen. We were not prepared at all. We were really, really unprepared. And so as much as you want to have the left make the argument that, we did this for simply money purposes, and that's a valid complaint, I think the right could make the argument right back to the left and say, when we're not leading and when we're not prepared and when we don't have our military ready to go for a war, bad things happen. But kind of like World War II, we get in woefully underprepared, but we get moving pretty quick. By the end of the war, we will have registered 24 million American men. And guys, you will have the opportunity to be by the Post Service. When you turn age 18, you'll get a little note from the U.S. Post Service saying you need to register for the draft. And I would strongly encourage you to do that because the United States government does not take kindly to those that do not register. That doesn't mean you're getting drafted. That just means if they want to send you a little note to say, we're going to need your services at some point in time, they can find you. Again, I would encourage you to not throw that note away. The United States government does not take kindly to it. Of the 24 million that are registered at the end of 1918, 3 million will be chosen. There was a lottery that you went through, and if you were one of those lucky number that got picked, you had to go and serve. And of the 3 million that were chosen by the lottery, 2 million of them will end up reaching the shores of Europe. And 3/4 of that 2 million is going to see action. Women were not allowed to be drafted. Women have never been allowed to be drafted. And this would be the first time now that women can serve in combat. So we didn't have women serve in combat any time in America's history until 3 years ago. We did have some 13,000 of women serve as nurses, secretaries, and the support staff. As far as minorities, African Americans served double their proportion. In 1915, I would have said that the African American population in the United States would have been somewhere around 3 to 4%. So you're looking at 8%. They were still segregated. It's amazing to think that 100 years ago, you were still segregated and you didn't have whites serving with black. But in World War I, the most decorated infantry unit out there was the 369th, which was an all-black regiment, and it saw more action in World War I than any other group. So that's kind of an interesting fact. The big thing we had to do when we got involved in the war is we were getting our ships sunk at an amazing rate by the German submarines. We would send our merchant ships over there, and they would have the English Channel where we would go into the British Isles, and we'd be trying to get to England to give them supplies. Germany was just picking off our ships at an enormous rate. And we finally realized that we can't send these ships by themselves. So we would send them in a convoy system where we would be protected. These convoys would be protected by cruisers and destroyers that had depth chargers. Cruisers and destroyers are much faster than submarines, and you can hear the engines below. And when we could hear those, we could go over the top of them with these depth charges. They were 55-gallon barrels filled with explosives, and we would throw them, not literally, but we'd catapult them off the back end, and they were very effective in sinking the German submarines. The convoy system ended up being an effective way to getting supplies to Great Britain. And here's just a picture that we would have of all these ships that would be protected by a convoy of our U.S. Navy. The fighting force that we used in World War I was called American Expeditionary Force. One of the agreements that we made when we went into the war was we were not going to allow England or France to be in charge of us. So we said, no, we will be our own fighting force, and we will be underneath the direction of American generals. We're not going to have you guys tell us how we're going to run the war. And so General John Pershing, famous general, is going to lead us. The nickname for American soldiers was Doughboys, because we looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy in these wool outfits and our backpacks and the knee-high kind of pants with the socks up high and that. One of the most famous doughboys of all was a guy by the name of Elvin York. And Mr. York, who was originally a conscientious objector, which meaning he would not fight because of religious reasons, ended up being kind of like we will see in World War II. He's going to end up being one of the biggest heroes that we've got in, and he's a corporal, and he becomes a hero back in America after we find out that in the field, this guy does an amazing things. And I'm trying to remember the gentleman that will do the same thing in the Asian Empire, not the Asian Empire, but in the fight against Japan. William Doss will be the gentleman I'm speaking of in World War II, another conscientious objector. But Mr. York is going to, as the slide says, do an amazing feat of coming back with 132 soldiers, and that's just amazing, And there's just an example of one of our guys. About the time that the United States does get into the war, though, a big blow goes to the Allies because Russia will get out of the war. So almost immediately, once we get in May, Russia will drop out, and that will end the two-front war. Germany had to expand their forces on both the east and west front, and the Russian army and the Russian losses and the fact that they had run out of money was an incredibly heavy toll. Civilians were dying on massive scales of starvation. They couldn't get supplies, and the government couldn't find a way to do it. And the Tsar, Nicholas, he didn't have an answer to it. And finally, in May of 1917, the people had had enough, and there was people that had risen up against them. And so in May of 1917, the Bolsheviks, which is the communist group led by the leader, a guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin, he'll be the first leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, and he'll be in power in the Soviet Union from 1917 until Mr. Stalin in 1928, I believe. He'll come to power and he will seize, and communism will come in there, and Russia will pull out of the war and sign a peace treaty with Germany. Now Germany can turn all of its forces against the Western Front and France and England and now the new United States. Germany quickly marches to almost 50 miles just outside of Paris. So we're fighting the whole battle over there in France. Just about this time, here comes the American forces arriving, and they stop the German advance, and they turn it back around. Remember, we get involved in April of 1917, and we're able to turn the tide in about 6 months. Germany has run out of money, and they're not paying their soldiers anymore. They're not paying their Navy. It's one thing to go die for your country, but when you're not getting paid and you can't send the money home, that's a whole different thing. So there will actually be Germans starting to revolt. And by November 3rd of 1918, the last great push offensive, which will last for 40 days, and we're watching a movie right now called The Lost Battalion, in which the Americans and the Allies will put this huge push against the Germans. The German Navy will abandon their post. And quickly right after that, the Kaiser, which is the equivalent of the king, Kaiser Wilhelm II, will leave his throne. He'll run because he's going to be overthrown, and retreats to Holland. And that'll happen. And within 2 days, on November 11th of 1918, Germany will decide to get out of the war. And then you're going to have a state of what's going to happen next. And so we're going to take a look next at the peace process and what's going to come about from there. But there you have World War I in from the United States standpoint. And now we'll take a look at what Europe looks like in 1918 and the economies of all of Europe. And guess who's still sitting here on the outside waiting to help rebuild these countries and to sell them goods? And that'll be the United States. And our economy will grow because of that, and we'll become even a bigger and larger player in the world. So we'll be looking at that next.